Margaret Collins was 79, a kind widow with soft grey hair and eyes full of warmth. She had lived a long life of love and quiet devotion beside her late husband, John. When he passed away, her heart broke, but her son David promised, "You'll live with us, Mom. You'll never have to worry again." So she moved into David and Emma's neat little house in the suburbs. At first, everything was comforting. Margaret helped around the kitchen, folded laundry, and told bedtime stories to her grandchildren. She often said with a smile, "I may walk slowly, but I'm still useful." And David would kiss her forehead and answer, "You're part of this family always." For a while, she believed it. The laughter of her grandchildren filled the house, and she felt she had a purpose again. But life has a way of changing quietly, without warning, without sound. For the first few months, life in David's home was gentle and full of warmth. Emma was polite, even affectionate at times. She brought Margaret tea in the afternoons, and they would talk about recipes or the children's school. David worked long hours but always stopped by his mother's room at night to ask, "Do you need anything, Mom?" Margaret felt grateful. She tried to be helpful, folding the children's clothes, peeling vegetables, watering the flowers. On weekends, the whole family sat together for dinner. David would tease his mother about her old stories, and everyone would laugh. In those moments, Margaret felt like she belonged again. Her husband's photograph stood by the window, catching the morning sun. She often smiled at it and whispered, "We raised a good man, didn't we?" But little by little, things began to change. Emma stopped joining her for tea. She complained that Margaret used too much electricity or left crumbs on the table. David began coming home later, his face heavy with stress. The sound of laughter disappeared from the dinner table, replaced by sighs and quiet arguments behind closed doors. One evening, as Margaret tried to thank Emma for making dinner, Emma only replied sharply, "It's fine. You don't need to thank me every time." That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She didn't know what she had done wrong, but the air in the house felt colder than ever. And deep inside, she began to fear that her son's promise, "You'll never be alone, Mom," might no longer be true. At first, Margaret tried to ignore it, the uneaten plates, the hushed tones, the sudden quiet that filled the house whenever she entered the room. But the warmth that once wrapped her days had turned thin, like a blanket worn by time. Her meals sat untouched on the table. Her stories went unanswered. And her laughter, once met with smiles, now echoed against walls that refused to listen. One night, while heading to the kitchen for water, she stopped at the sound of voices. Behind the half-closed door, Emma whispered sharply, "Your mother's getting worse, David. We can't keep doing this forever." David's voice trembled. "She's my mom, Emma. She has nowhere else to go." "And what about us?" Emma replied, "We can't save anything anymore. The medicine, the food, the bills, it's too much. We have our own family to think about." Margaret's heart clenched. She stood in the hallway, her frail hands shaking as she pressed them to her chest. She didn't want to cause trouble. She didn't want to hear more. That night, she couldn't sleep. The ceiling above her felt lower somehow, like the world was closing in. The next morning, she rose early to cook breakfast, her way of apologizing for simply existing. But Emma entered the kitchen and stopped her. "You should rest, Margaret," she said flatly. "We'll handle things." Her tone wasn't cruel, but there was no warmth left in it. From that day on, Margaret stopped trying. She ate quietly in her room, folded her clothes in silence, and spoke only when spoken to. David came home late, tired and distant, his smiles replaced by sighs. The grandchildren visited less often. The house that once sang with life now moved through days of dull stillness. Sometimes at night, Margaret whispered to the photo of her husband, "I think they're tired of me, dear. But I don't blame them. I just wish I wasn't so old." Then, one cold evening, she heard it again, Emma's voice, low but sharp. "David, we can't keep her here. It's not fair to anyone. Maybe we should take her somewhere." Margaret held her breath in the dark. David didn't answer. That silence, that long, aching silence, told her everything she needed to know. A week later, David knocked on his mother's door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mom," he said softly, "how about we go on a little trip tomorrow? You've been indoors too long. The countryside will be good for you, fresh air, quiet roads." Margaret's eyes brightened like a child's. "Oh, how lovely. I haven't seen the hills in years." She spent the evening packing a small bag, her shawl, her Bible, and a tin of cookies for the road. As she folded her blanket, she whispered to herself, "My son still cares. Maybe I was wrong." The next morning, the sky was gray and heavy. They drove in silence. Margaret hummed old songs under her breath, songs David used to love as a boy. But he didn't hum along. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed ahead. After several hours, the city disappeared behind them. The road wound through fields and forests, growing narrower with each turn. "Where are we going, dear?" she asked gently. "Just somewhere peaceful," he replied, his voice distant. When they stopped, the air was cold and still. The forest stretched endlessly around them, the ground covered in fallen leaves. David stepped out first, then helped her from the car. "Be careful, Mom," he said quietly, spreading a blanket on the damp earth. "Sit here for a while. I'll just go check something nearby." She nodded. "Don't be long. It's chilly out here." He smiled faintly, that same gentle smile she'd always trusted, then turned and walked back to the car. She watched the headlights flicker once, then fade into darkness. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The forest grew silent except for the whisper of wind through the trees. "David?" she called softly. No answer. Her voice trembled. "David?" Only the rustling of leaves replied. Margaret's hands clutched the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes searched the darkness, desperate for the sound of an engine, the sight of headlights, anything. But there was nothing. Finally, she sat down on the cold ground, tears running silently down her wrinkled cheeks. "I see," she whispered. "You didn't take me for the air. You took me to forget me." Above her, the stars blinked faintly through the clouds. She closed her eyes, shivering, not from the cold, but from the quiet truth settling in her chest. Her son was gone. And for the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant to be forgotten. The night stretched endlessly across the silent hills. Margaret sat curled beneath her thin blanket, the cold biting into her bones. She whispered prayers beneath her breath, her voice trembling in the wind. "Lord, please, keep him safe," she murmured, thinking not of herself but of David. She remembered the nights when he was small, when storms frightened him and he would crawl into her bed, clutching her hand tightly. Back then, she had promised, "I'll never let anything hurt you." Now, years later, it was that same hand that had left her behind. Tears stung her eyes. "I must have done something wrong," she whispered to the dark. "He wouldn't leave me. Not really. He's just lost." Her strength faded with the night. The stars blurred, the wind grew colder. She leaned against a tree, closing her eyes, praying she'd see morning. When the first light touched the horizon, footsteps approached, hurried, heavy. A man walking his dog froze when he saw her frail figure wrapped in a blanket. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he called, kneeling beside her. Margaret opened her eyes slowly. Her lips trembled, but she managed a faint smile. I got lost," she whispered softly. He covered her with his coat and called for help. Within minutes, the sound of sirens broke the stillness of the morning. At the hospital, nurses rushed to care for her. Warm blankets, hot tea, gentle voices. One of them leaned close and asked kindly, "Who can we call for you?" Margaret stared at her hands, pale and trembling. She wanted to say David's name, but the words caught in her throat. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, "No one. There's no one left to call." After a few days in the hospital, the doctors said Margaret was well enough to leave. But there was no family to come for her. No one called. No one asked. So, the social worker gently said, "Mrs. Collins, we found a place for you, a lovely care home called Maple Grove. You'll be safe there." When she first arrived, the halls felt strange and unfamiliar. White walls, soft music, people in wheelchairs, nurses in pastel uniforms. Margaret sat quietly by the window for hours, watching the trees sway outside. She spoke little, ate little, and spent most of her time holding a small photo of David as a child. But slowly, life at Maple Grove began to touch her heart. One morning, another resident, a cheerful woman named Rose, offered her tea and said, "You remind me of my sister. Sit with me." That was how it began. Soon, Margaret was chatting in the common room, sharing stories of her youth, the dances, the old songs, the days she baked bread with her husband. Her laughter, soft and sincere, began to fill the space. Every week, a group of children from the local school came to sing for the residents. Margaret always sat in the front row, clapping and humming along. Sometimes, she'd close her eyes and imagine her grandchildren among them, happy, innocent, untouched by bitterness. The staff adored her. They called her Grandma Collins, not out of pity, but out of love. She knitted scarves for everyone, remembered birthdays, and left small notes of encouragement on the tables. "You are loved. Every morning is a new chance." One afternoon, a nurse asked her gently, "Mrs. Collins, do you have any family we can contact?" Margaret smiled, a peaceful, knowing smile. "My son lives far away," she said softly. "But I have a big family now." As the sun set through the garden windows, Margaret sat with her new friends, holding hands and laughing over tea. For the first time in a long while, her heart felt full. She had learned something precious. That love doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes, it grows from kindness, shared pain, and the courage to open your heart again. Years later, Margaret sat by the same window at Maple Grove, the one that overlooked the garden where children came to play. The evening sun spilled golden light across her face, and she smiled, calm, content, and unafraid. A new nurse, curious about her gentle demeanor, asked, "Mrs. Collins, do you ever think about your son?" Margaret's eyes softened. "Every day," she said quietly, but not with anger. "I hope he's well. I hope he's kind to his own children, and that they never forget him." There was no bitterness in her voice, only grace. Forgiveness had become her final gift, not to her son but to herself. She had learned that holding on to pain only keeps the wound open. Letting go doesn't erase what happened, but it allows life to bloom again. In forgiving David, she had found her peace. At Maple Grove, her story became part of the place, told by nurses to new residents, shared over tea on quiet afternoons. They called her the forgotten mother, but those who knew her understood the truth. She was not forgotten at all. She was remembered for her kindness, her laughter, and her ability to love even after being abandoned. On her final birthday, surrounded by friends and laughter, she said softly, "Sometimes, the family you lose makes space for the family you find." Life has strange ways of giving back. Her story reminds us that even after betrayal, there is always room for healing. Love may leave, but compassion, the kind we give ourselves, always stays. If someone you loved forgot you, would you forgive them? If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more emotional English stories.